47 years ago, on a cold March night in 1958, a man in Macon, Georgia, disappeared from his back porch in the middle of a rainstorm, leaving behind a still-burning cigarette, a cooling cup of black coffee, and a wife who said she'd only been upstairs folding laundry. No footprints led away from the house. No car was missing. No signs of struggle. Just an impossible vanishing that turned the small lakeside town into a web of suspicion and whispered accusations. Police questioned the wife, Mara Whitfield, a calm, composed woman known for choosing her words carefully, but without evidence. The case was stamped missing person, unresolved, and locked away in the Bibb County files. Then, for nearly 5 decades, Harold Whitfield's disappearance became nothing more than local folklore, the kind of ghost story teenagers told on dares. Until a young GBI detective stumbled across a yellowed case file and noticed something everyone else had missed. A sealed thermos with a handwritten note, an insurance policy signed just weeks before the disappearance, and the faint scent of almonds that an old sheriff couldn't quite name. From those fragments, she began pulling at threads that unraveled a meticulously crafted lie, a marriage soaked in quiet rage, a poison that mimicked peace, and a body buried beneath what should have been the foundation of Macon's future. Before we dive into the chilling truth behind Harold Whitfield's death, let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe that justice doesn't age, it only waits. Hit subscribe to follow the next chapter of this story. The night of March 22, 1958, rain hammered the tin roof of the Whitfield house overlooking Lake Benmore, just outside Macon. The sound was relentless, drowning out everything but the occasional roll of thunder across the water. Inside the small wood-frame home, yellow light spilled from the kitchen window, cutting through the downpour like a lone beacon. Harold Whitfield, 39, a well-respected builder known throughout Bibb County for his patience and craftsmanship, sat at the kitchen table reviewing blueprints for his most ambitious project yet, a series of lakeside vacation cabins that could transform the town's economy. His wife, Mara, moved quietly between the stove and the table, setting down a plate of fried catfish and creamed corn, then refilling his coffee from a silver thermos that sat on the counter. The scent of coffee, sharp and bitter, mixed with the humid air rolling in through the cracked window. They spoke little that evening. Harold mentioned the cabin permits, the timber orders, the contractor arriving Monday. Mara nodded, her voice soft, almost distant, as she said, "You work too hard, Harold." He smiled, the kind of tired smile men give when they've heard the same line 100 times. "Just a few more months, and we'll be set." He pushed back from the table, stretched his shoulders, and pulled a pack of cigarettes from his shirt pocket. "I'm stepping out for a smoke, be right back." A simple, ordinary statement. The last words Mara Whitfield would ever hear her husband speak. 11:45 p.m. Mara watched through the rain-streaked kitchen window as Harold stepped onto the back porch, lighter flaring briefly in the darkness before settling into a steady glow. 12:30 a.m. That glow was gone. She dried her hands on a dish towel, glanced at the clock, then walked to the back door. The porch was empty. Rain poured off the roof in sheets pooling on the warped wooden boards. Harold's cigarette lighter sat on the railing, still warm to the touch. Ash scattered across the planks, already dissolving in the wet. No muddy tracks, no trail into the yard, no sound but rain, and the low croak of bullfrogs echoing from the lake below. She called his name once. "Harold?" Then louder, her voice swallowed by the storm. Nothing. The air grew heavy, thick with something she couldn't name. Mara pulled a cardigan over her shoulders, grabbed the flashlight from the hook by the door and stepped into the rain. The beam cut weakly through the mist, sweeping over pine trees, the tool shed, the gravel drive where Harold's truck still sat, engine cold. She circled the house twice, checking the shed door, locked. The garage, his tools hung neatly on pegboard. His wristwatch sat on the entry table, still ticking. Everything was exactly where it should be, except Harold. The rain beat harder now, drumming against the roof, hissing through the grass. The porch light swayed slightly in the wind, casting jittery shadows across the yard. The kitchen clock ticked past 12:45, then whung. Mara stood in the center of the living room, dripping water onto the braided rug, her breath coming short and shallow. She stared at the wall-mounted telephone for a long moment before finally crossing the room and lifting the receiver. Static crackled on the line. Her voice shook as she gave the operator the number for the Bibb County Sheriff's Office. A man's voice answered, rough with sleep. "Sheriff's Office. What's the emergency?" "My husband," she said, her words catching. "He went outside to smoke and he didn't come back. I've looked everywhere. He's just gone." A pause. Then, "Did he take a vehicle?" "No. The truck's here. His watch is here. Everything's here." Another pause. Longer this time. Then quieter. "We'll send someone out." She set the receiver back in its cradle and stood there, listening to the rain hammer the roof, the wind rattle the porch screen, the clock tick in the corner. Outside, the yellow porch light flickered once, twice, then steadied, a lone signal cutting through the storm. 20 minutes later, headlights pierced the darkness, and Deputy Ed Lawson stepped out into the rain, his hat pulled low, his eyes already scanning the scene with the kind of suspicion that would haunt him for the rest of his career. And to understand how a respected builder became a buried secret, and how his wife became one of the most quietly dangerous women in Georgia history, we need to go back further. Back to the beginning. To the marriage that looked perfect from the outside, and the cracks that no one saw forming underneath. But first, there was the search. By dawn on March 23, 1958, the rain had softened to a drizzle, but the damage was done. Any tracks, any scent, any evidence that might have led away from the Whitfield house had been washed into the mud or carried down toward Lake Benmore. Deputy Ed Lawson stood on the back porch where Harold had last been seen, his boots leaving fresh prints in the sodden wood, and felt the weight of something he couldn't yet name pressing against his ribs. Nothing about this felt right. By 8 a.m., Lawson had mobilized every available man in Bibb County. Neighbors arrived with flashlights and thermoses of coffee. The volunteer fire department brought ropes and grappling hooks. Old Curtis Hale, who'd lived on the lake for 40 years, brought his hound dogs, 3 blue-tick coonhounds that could supposedly track a scent through hell itself. They started at the porch where Harold's cigarette ash still clung in damp clumps to the railing. The dogs circled, sniffed, whined, and sat down. Curtis tugged their leads, coaxed them toward the tree line, but they only circled back to the same spot, confused and listless, as if the scent had simply evaporated mid-step. "Rain's killed it," Curtis muttered, shaking his head. "Ain't nothing left to follow." Lawson divided the men into groups. One swept the woods behind the property, calling Harold's name into the dripping pines. Another combed the shoreline, checking boat docks, fishing shacks, and the narrow footpaths that wound along the water's edge. A third group, led by Deputy Tom Riley, dragged the shallows of Lake Benmore with weighted nets and long poles, their faces grim and silent as the work went on for hours. They found nothing. No clothing, no signs of struggle, no body. By mid-afternoon, the search expanded to Lot 14, the lakeside property where Harold had been working on his cabin project. Lawson drove out alone, his tires crunching over gravel still slick from the night's rain. The construction site sat on a low ridge overlooking the water, surrounded by stacks of fresh lumber, bags of cement, and the skeletal frames of 3 half-built cabins. It looked abandoned, though work had stopped only the day before. Lawson walked the perimeter slowly, his eyes scanning every detail. Harold's toolbox sat open near the foundation of the first cabin, a hammer still lying across a bed of nails. A thermos, silver, dented, and marked with Harold's initials, sat on a sawhorse near the entrance. Lawson picked it up, unscrewed the cap, and sniffed. Coffee, gone cold and slightly sour. He poured a few drops onto his palm. Dark, bitter, with faint sediment at the bottom. He made a note in his logbook, then sealed the thermos in a canvas evidence bag. Nearby, he found boot prints in the mud. Harold's work boots, size 11, same tread as the pair sitting by the Whitfields' front door. The prints led from the toolbox toward the foundation, then stopped abruptly at the edge of a concrete pad that had been poured 2 days earlier. Lawson crouched, studying the hardened surface. Smooth, unmarked, perfectly cured. He stood frowning and looked back toward the trees. Nothing led away. Nothing led anywhere. Back in town, the rumor mill had already begun to churn. By Sunday morning, the story had spread through Mon like creek water after a storm. Whispered over church pews, traded at the diner, passed along phone lines in hushed, urgent tones. Some said Harold had debts. Others claimed he'd been seen with a woman from the next county over, a pretty secretary who worked at the timber yard in Waynesboro. A few suggested Mara herself had driven him away with her cold silences and sharp glance, the kind of quiet cruelty that didn't leave bruises but wore a man down to nothing. And when the insurance policy surfaced, $40,000, signed just 2 weeks before Harold's disappearance, the whispers turned to accusations. Mara Whitfield became the center of every conversation she wasn't part of. Lawson questioned her 3 times in the first week. Each time she answered calmly, cooperatively, her hands folded in her lap, her voice steady and soft. She wore the same navy dress to each interview, her hair pinned neatly, her face composed in a way that made Lawson's deputy call her cold as January. But Lawson saw something else, something harder to name. Not guilt exactly, but not grief either. "Mrs. Whitfield," he asked during their second meeting, "did your husband have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to hurt him?" Mara looked at him with pale, unblinking eyes. "He wasn't the kind of man people fought with," she said. "He just worked." "What about money troubles, debts?" "We lived within our means." "Arguments? Problems at home?" A pause, so brief it might have been imagined. "No more than any marriage has." Lawson leaned forward. "You said you were upstairs folding laundry when he went outside. How long were you up there?" 15 minutes, maybe 20. "And you didn't hear anything? No shout, no car, no door closing?" "The rain was loud," she said simply. "I didn't hear anything." Lawson studied her face, searching for cracks, for something beneath the surface. But Mara Whitfield's expression remained smooth, unreadable, like glass over deep water. Deputy Tom Riley had his own theory, and he wasn't shy about sharing it. "Ed, listen," he said one evening as they sat in the dim back office of the sheriff's station, surrounded by maps and witness statements that led nowhere. "Sometimes a man just walks away, gets tired of his life, tired of his wife, tired of the whole damn thing. Maybe Harold Whitfield decided he didn't want to be Harold Whitfield anymore." Lawson shook his head. "He left his wallet, his truck, his tools. So he wanted a clean break. And his wedding ring?" Riley shrugged. "People do strange things." But Lawson couldn't accept it. He'd walked that porch a dozen times now, retraced Harold's last steps, stood in the same spot where the man had smoked his last cigarette, and every time the same thought returned. Everything looks too clean. Late one night, alone in his office, Lawson opened his leather logbook and wrote in careful slanted handwriting. March 30th, 1958. No physical evidence of foul play. No witnesses. No body. Wife cooperative but emotionally detached. Financial motive present. Insurance. Rain eliminated all trails. Search efforts exhausted. Everything looks too clean. Suspicion remains. He underlined the last 2 words twice. By early April, the official search was called off. The case was reclassified as a missing person. Unresolved. Harold Whitfield's name was entered into state records, his photograph distributed to neighboring counties, and his file placed in a gray cabinet in the Bibb County Courthouse, where it would sit, untouched, for decades. But Lawson couldn't let it go. He drove past the Whitfield house on his rounds, watching the windows, the porch, the driveway where Harold's truck still sat gathering pollen. He returned to Lot 14 on his days off, walking the site alone, searching for something he couldn't name. And Mara continued her life with the same quiet efficiency she'd always had. She attended church on Sundays, nodded politely to neighbors who no longer met her eyes, and tended her garden as if nothing had changed. But the town had turned on her. Mothers pulled their children closer when she walked by. The grocer's wife stopped inviting her to the ladies' auxiliary meetings. At the post office, conversations died when she entered. One evening in late April, as the sun set over Lake Benmore and the cicadas began their nightly chorus, Lawson made one final visit to the Whitfield house. He knocked, and Mara answered, her face framed in the yellow glow of the porch light. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, hat in hand. "I just wanted you to know, we're still looking." She nodded slowly. "I appreciate that, Deputy." He hesitated, then added, "If there's anything you want to tell me, anything at all, now's the time." Mara's expression didn't change. "I've told you everything I know." Lawson held her gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked back to his car. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Mara stood on the porch, her silhouette backlit and motionless, watching him leave. The rain had stopped days ago, but the air still felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. The silence that settled over Mon, Georgia that spring wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of things buried deep, waiting. And somewhere, beneath concrete and soil and time, Harold Whitfield waited too. By late May 1958, the official investigation into Harold Whitfield's disappearance had quietly collapsed under its own weight. The Bibb County Sheriff's Office had exhausted every lead, interviewed every neighbor, searched every inch of shoreline and forest within a 5-mile radius. They had nothing. No body, no witness, no confession, no evidence that a crime had even been committed. On June 3rd, the coroner's inquest convened in the cramped second-floor courtroom of the Bibb County Courthouse. The proceedings lasted less than 2 hours. Deputy Ed Lawson testified about the search efforts, the lack of physical evidence, the rain that had washed away any potential trails. Curtis Hale spoke about his hound's failure to track a scent. Tom Riley presented the financial records, noting Harold's stable income and lack of debt, though he conspicuously avoided mentioning the insurance policy that everyone in town already knew about. Mara Whitfield sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed and pale. She wore black, though no body had been found. When called to testify, she repeated the same story she'd told Lawson a dozen times. Harold had gone outside to smoke. She'd been upstairs. When she came down, he was gone. Her voice never wavered. Her eyes never filled with tears. The coroner, a thin man named Dr. Wesley Pruitt, who'd held the position for nearly 20 years, reviewed the file with the weary air of someone who'd seen this script before. Missing men in small towns, unexplained disappearances, cases that went nowhere because there was nowhere for them to go. His ruling came at 3:47 p.m., recorded in neat typewritten letters on official county stationery. Harold James Whitfield, presumed missing. No evidence of foul play. No remains recovered. Status, unresolved. And just like that, the case was closed. Within 6 weeks, Mara Whitfield had put the house up for sale. By August, she'd cashed the $40,000 life insurance policy, a sum that raised eyebrows but no formal objections, since the insurance company had investigated and found no grounds to deny the claim. By September, she was gone. Some said she'd moved to North Carolina. Others heard it was Tennessee, or maybe Virginia. The truth, though no one in Mon would learn it for decades, was Asheville, where she'd quietly resumed using her maiden name, Ellison, and rented a modest apartment on the north side of town. She left behind an empty house, a for-sale sign that swayed in the autumn wind, and a town full of people who would never stop wondering. Ed Lawson couldn't sleep. Night after night, he lay awake in his narrow bed above the hardware store his family owned, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of that rainy March night. He saw Harold's cigarette lighter on the railing, still warm, the coffee cup on the counter, the thermos at the worksite, the boot prints that led nowhere. He returned to the Whitfield house more times than he could count, even after the for sale sign went up, even after the new owners, a young couple from Atlanta, moved in and painted the shutters blue. He walked the porch, paced the yard, stood at the spot where Harold had last been seen and tried to feel what had happened there. One October afternoon, he drove out to Lot 14 again. The cabin project had been abandoned after Harold's disappearance. No one wanted to finish what a missing man had started. The lumber had grayed and warped. Weeds pushed up through the concrete foundation. Lawson sat on the tailgate of his truck, holding the sealed evidence bag containing Harold's thermos, and unscrewed the cap one more time. The coffee had long since evaporated, leaving only a faint brown residue crusted around the bottom. He lifted it to his nose and inhaled slowly. Something lingered there, something beneath the coffee, beneath the metal and rust. Sweet, almost floral. Familiar in a way he couldn't place. Like almonds mixed with something sharper. Metallic. He'd smelled it before, he was certain of it. But where? He sat there for a long time, watching the sun set over Lake Benmore, trying to pull the memory from wherever it hid in the back of his mind. But it wouldn't come. It stayed just out of reach, like a word on the tip of his tongue, a face half remembered from a dream. That night, alone in his small apartment, Lawson opened his personal journal, a leather-bound notebook he kept separate from his official reports, and wrote, October 14th, 1958, the thermos. There's something in it I can't name. Sweet. Chemical. Like almonds and metal. I've smelled it before. Somewhere. If truth sinks, the rain will bring it back someday. He closed the journal and placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath old tax forms and forgotten letters. He wouldn't write in it again for months. Time moved forward the way it always does in small towns, slowly, inexorably, swallowing the past one season at a time. By 1959, new families had moved into Mancha. New children played along the lakeshore. The Whitfield house changed hands twice, its history becoming part of the local lore, the kind of story people told at barbecues and church socials with a mix of fascination and unease. You know, that house used to belong to the man who vanished? Just walked off his porch and never came back. They say his wife did it, but they never proved a thing. By 1960, Harold's name appeared less and less in conversation. His blueprints for the lakeside cabins were filed away in the county planning office, gathering dust. The concrete foundation at Lot 14, the one he'd poured 2 days before he disappeared, was overgrown with kudzu and wild grass, slowly being reclaimed by the Georgia soil. Ed Lawson continued his work as a deputy, responding to drunken disorderlies, settling property disputes, helping search for lost children who always turned up safe. He married a schoolteacher named Ruth in 1961. They had 2 daughters. He aged the way men do when they carry something they can't let go of, his hair graying early, lines deepening around his eyes, a quietness settling over him that his wife learned not to ask about. But he never forgot Harold Whitfield. He never forgot the thermos, the rain, the impossibility of a man vanishing without a trace. And he never forgot Mara's pale, unblinking eyes when she'd said, "He just worked." The journal stayed in his drawer, untouched but never thrown away. By the mid-1960s, Lot 14 had been sold to a developer who saw potential in the lake property. The old foundation was buried under new construction, a small campground with rental cabins, a boat launch, and a gravel parking lot. Families came in the summers, roasting marshmallows and swimming in the shallows, never knowing what lay beneath the earth they walked on. By the 1970s, Harold Whitfield had become a ghost story. Teenagers dared each other to walk past the old house after dark. Some claimed to see a figure on the porch, a glowing cigarette tip floating in the shadows. Others said they heard footsteps on rainy nights, pacing the yard, searching for something lost. Ed Lawson retired from the Bibb County Sheriff's Office in 1985, his career marked by a reputation for thoroughness and an instinct for cases that didn't quite add up. At his retirement party, Someone joked about the one that got away, the Whitfield case, the mystery that had never been solved. Lawson smiled thinly and said nothing. He died in 1991 at the age of 63 of a heart attack in his sleep. His wife found the journal in his desk when she was sorting through his things. She opened it once, read the line about truth and rain, and closed it again. She didn't throw it away. She boxed it with his other papers and stored it in the attic where it would remain, unread, for another decade. And in the Bibb County evidence vault, deep in the basement of the courthouse, the Harold Whitfield case file sat in a cardboard box marked 1958, unresolved, buried beneath hundreds of other forgotten cases, slowly yellowing in the dark. The house stood. The lake reflected the sky. The concrete at Lot 14 settled deeper into the earth, and Harold Whitfield, wherever he was, or whatever was left of him, waited in silence. For nearly 50 years, the Whitfield case gathered dust, locked away in the past, filed under unsolved and unresolved and gone, waiting for someone who would look at it with new eyes, waiting for technology that didn't yet exist, waiting for a detective who would ask the questions that Ed Lawson had asked but couldn't answer, waiting for the rain to bring the truth back. Sarah Darnell joined the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Cold Case Division on a gray Monday in September 2005, carrying a single cardboard box of personal belongings and a reputation for being the quietest person in any room she entered. At 33, she'd spent nearly a decade working property crimes and financial fraud for the GBI, cases built on paper trails and patience, the kind of work that required you to sit in dim offices for hours, chasing threads through decades-old records until a pattern finally emerged. She was good at it, better than good. She had the kind of mind that could hold 1,000 details at once, sorting and cross-referencing them in ways that seemed almost instinctive. Her colleagues called her meticulous. Her ex-husband had called her obsessive. Both were right. The Cold Case Division occupied a cramped corner of the GBI's Atlanta field office, tucked between the evidence vault and a storage room filled with obsolete filing cabinets. It wasn't glamorous work. Most days she sat alone at a scratched metal desk, digitizing files from cases that had gone cold in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Murders, missing persons, unsolved arsons, scanning yellowed reports into the database page by page, trying to preserve what little remained before time erased it completely. She found the work strangely comforting. There was something about these old cases, these forgotten stories that felt important in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Every file represented a life interrupted, a question left unanswered, a family still waiting for closure decades after everyone else had moved on. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes new technology or a fresh pair of eyes could crack a case that had seemed hopeless 30 years earlier. That's what kept her there, night after night, long after the rest of the office had gone home. It was late October, past 11 p.m., when she found the Whitfield file. The office was empty except for the hum of the ancient fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional creak of the building settling. Sarah sat at her desk, working through a box of 1950s cases from Bibb County, a rural jurisdiction that had been absorbed into a larger sheriff's office in the 1970s. Most of the files were straightforward: bar fights, petty thefts, domestic disputes that had been resolved or abandoned decades ago. Then she pulled a manila folder marked in faded ink: Whitfield, Harold, missing person, March 1958. She almost set it aside with the others. Missing persons from the 1950s rarely had happy endings, and even fewer had enough surviving evidence to reopen. But something made her pause. Maybe it was the handwriting on the folder tab, careful, deliberate, the letters formed by someone who'd taken the time to write neatly. Or maybe it was the single word stamped in red across the top: unresolved. She opened the folder. Inside were 3 typewritten pages, a hand-drawn map of a property near Lake Benmore, and a series of witness statements paper-clipped together. She scanned the opening report. March 23, 1958. Harold Whitfield, age 39, reported missing by wife Mara Whitfield. Subject last seen on back porch of residence at approx. 11:45 p.m. No signs of struggle. No vehicle missing. Extensive search conducted. No remains recovered. Standard language. Nothing unusual. But at the bottom of the third page, someone, presumably the investigating officer, had written in pen, "Male disappearance, Crotty Porch, March 1958, possible domestic." And below that, underlined twice, "Everything looks too clean. Suspicion remains." Sarah sat back in her chair, tapping her pen against the desk. Suspicion remains. That wasn't standard language. That was personal. That was an investigator who hadn't believed the story, who'd sensed something wrong, but couldn't prove it. She flipped through the witness statements. The wife, Mara Whitfield, had been questioned multiple times. Her answers were consistent, almost rehearsed. "He went upstairs to smoke. I was upstairs. When I come back, he was gone." The neighbors had reported nothing unusual. The search had turned up nothing. The case had simply stopped. But at the back of the file, clipped to a faded evidence log, was a single line that caught Sarah's attention. Item number 3, thermos, silver, dented. Found at worksite, lot 14. Contains coffee residue, sealed for storage. Coffee residue from a thermos at a worksite. It seemed insignificant, the kind of detail that wouldn't have mattered in 1958, when forensic analysis meant little more than fingerprints and blood typing. But now, in 2005, with gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, residue could tell stories that investigators from 50 years ago couldn't have imagined. Sarah made a note in her digital log. Request physical evidence for Whitfield case, specifically item number 3. She worked through the rest of the box, but her mind kept circling back to that folder. Suspicion remains. Something about the phrase felt like a message across time, a detective from 1958 reaching forward to say, "I knew something was wrong. I just couldn't prove it." 2 days later, Sarah received a call from the evidence vault supervisor. "We found your box," he said, his voice crackling slightly over the phone. "Bibb County, 1958. It's down in the deep storage. You want me to bring it up?" "Please," Sarah said. The box arrived that afternoon, sealed with brittle packing tape that cracked when she touched it. The cardboard was water-stained and warped, the handwriting on the side faded to near illegibility. Whitfield, 1958. Sheriff E. Lawson. Sarah carried it to an empty conference room, spread a plastic sheet across the table, and carefully cut the tape. The smell hit her immediately. Dust, rust, and something faintly chemical, like old paper mixed with metal. Inside, wrapped in brown evidence bags that had turned brittle with age, were 3 items. A small silver thermos, dented along one side, with the initials HW scratched into the base. A marriage certificate, dated June 12, 1948, for Harold James Whitfield and Mara Louise Ellison. And 2 photographs, their edges curled and yellowed. The first showed a young couple standing in front of a church, both smiling stiffly at the camera. Harold was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that looked earnest and dependable. Mara was slender, pale, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. The second photo showed them on a porch, the same porch, Sarah realized, where Harold had disappeared. They weren't touching. They looked like strangers forced to stand side by side. Sarah set the photos aside and picked up the thermos. It was heavier than she'd expected, solid and cold in her hands. The cap was sealed with wax and an evidence tag signed by someone named E. Lawson, dated March 30th, 1958. She turned it slowly, studying the scratches, the dents, the faint brown stain crusted around the rim. Then she unscrewed the cap, carefully because the threads were corroded, and lifted it to her nose. The smell was faint, almost gone after 47 years, but it was there. Sweet. Metallic. Strange. She set the thermos down and stared at it for a long moment, her mind working through possibilities. Coffee residue from 1958. chemical analysis that hadn't been possible back then. A detective who'd written suspicion remains and never let go of the case. Sarah pulled out her phone and called the GBI forensic lab. "This is Detective Darnell, Cold Case Division," she said. "I need a chemical analysis on a sealed evidence item. Priority, low, time frame, 1958. The lab tech on the other end sighed. "What are we looking for?" "I don't know yet," Sarah said, still staring at the thermos. "Just tell me what's in there." She hung up and sat back in her chair, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the old evidence spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't yet learned how to assemble. She didn't know it then. She'd just opened the door that Ed Lawson has tried to open 47 years earlier. She didn't know that the thermos in her hands held the answer to a question an entire town had stopped asking. She only knew that something about this case felt unfinished. And Sarah Darnell had never been good at leaving things unfinished. Outside, rain began to fall, softly at first, then harder, drumming against the windows of the GBI office, as if the weather itself remembered what had happened on another rainy night decades ago in a small town called Mon. The Whitfield case had been waiting. And now, finally, someone was listening. The email arrived on a Wednesday morning, November 9th, 2005 at 9:47 a.m. Sarah Darnell was halfway through her second cup of coffee, reviewing a different case, a 1972 arson in Savannah, when her computer chimed with a new message. The subject line read, "Lab results, evidence item, 5804223, Whitfield." She clicked it open without much expectation. Most cold case evidence came back clean or too degraded to analyze. 50 years was a long time for chemical compounds to survive, even in a sealed container. But this one was different. She read the first line, then stopped, read it again, and felt something cold settle in her chest. Analysis of residue from thermos interior via gas chromatography mass spectrometry, GCMS, reveals trace quantities of cyanide compound, specifically potassium cyanide, KCN. Concentration suggests deliberate introduction to liquid contents. Chemical signature consistent with bitter almond scent noted in historical toxicology literature. Sarah sat perfectly still, her coffee forgotten, her eyes locked on the screen. Cyanide. In Harold Whitfield's thermos. From 1958. Her mind raced backward, pulling up the image of the case file, the faded handwriting, the note at the bottom of the third page. Everything looks too clean. Suspicion remains. And further back, to another note she'd found tucked into the evidence log, a deputy's observation from the scene. Thermos smells faintly of almond and vanilla, unable to identify. Ed Lawson had smelled it. He'd written it down. But in 1958, they hadn't had the tools to test for it. They hadn't known what it meant. Now, 47 years later, the thermos was speaking. Sarah printed the report, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, and walked directly to the office of her supervisor, Lieutenant Marcus Webb. She knocked once and entered without waiting for a response. "We need to reopen the Whitfield case," she said, sliding the lab report across his desk. Officially, Webb, a barrel-chested man in his mid-50s with 30 years in law enforcement, picked up the report and scanned it. His expression didn't change, but she saw his jaw tighten. "Cyanide," he said quietly. "In the coffee," Sarah confirmed. Harold Whitfield didn't disappear. He was poisoned. Webb set the report down and leaned back in his chair. 1958. That's almost 50 years. 47. Victim's been gone that long. The suspect, if there even is one, could be dead. "Could be," Sarah said. "But we won't know until we look." Webb studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, you've got authorization. Build the case. But Darnell..." He paused, his voice dropping. "If this goes somewhere, it goes public. Media, trial, the whole thing. Make sure you're ready for that." "I'm ready," she said. By that afternoon, the Whitfield case had been officially reopened, assigned a new case number, and entered into the GBI's active investigation database. Sarah assembled a small team, a financial forensics specialist named Kevin Park, and a document examiner named Lisa Ortiz, and gave them a single directive: find everything. Bank records, insurance policies, signatures, witness statements. I want to know every financial transaction Mara Whitfield made in the 2 years before and after her husband disappeared. The work was painstaking. Most records from 1958 existed only on paper, if they existed at all. But the GBI had digitized some county records over the years, and others could be requested from state archives. Kevin started with insurance companies, cross-referencing old policy numbers with actuarial databases. Lisa began analyzing handwriting samples from the case file, comparing signatures on witness statements and financial documents. 3 days later, Kevin knocked on Sarah's office door, holding a manila folder. "You're going to want to see this," he said. Inside was a photocopy of a life insurance policy, issued by Southern States Mutual Insurance Company on March 8, 1958, exactly 2 weeks before Harold Whitfield vanished. The policy was for $40,000, a substantial sum in 1958, equivalent to nearly $500,000 today. The beneficiary was listed as Mara Louise Whitfield, but it was the signature line that made Sarah's pulse quicken. The policy required 2 signatures, the insured and a witness. Harold's signature was there, neat and confident. Below it, the witness line read, H. Dyer. "Who's H. Dyer?" Kevin asked. "I don't know yet," Sarah said, "but we're going to find out." Lisa Ortiz provided the next piece. After analyzing the signatures under magnification and comparing them to known samples of Harold's handwriting from construction contracts and bank documents, she delivered her conclusion in a 2-page report. The signature attributed to Harold Whitfield on the insurance policy dated March 8, 1958, exhibits characteristics inconsistent with authenticated samples. Pressure points, letter formation, and pen angle suggest forgery. Confidence level, 87%. Forged. The insurance policy had been forged. Sarah sat in the conference room late that night, the evidence spread across the table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle finally beginning to form a picture. Cyanide in the coffee, a forged insurance policy, a substantial payout collected within months of the disappearance, and a witness named H. Dyer, whose identity was still unknown. She ran the name through every database she had access to: driver's licenses, voter registrations, property records, obituaries. Nothing came up in Bibb County. But when she expanded the search to neighboring counties, a single hit appeared. Helen Margaret Dyer, born 1913, last known address, Daytona Beach, Florida. Sarah picked up the phone. It took 2 days to track down Helen Dyer's current contact information. She was 92 years old, living in an assisted care facility in Ormond Beach, Florida. When Sarah finally reached her by phone, the woman's voice was thin and crackling, but her memory was sharp. "Mrs. Dyer," Sarah began carefully, "my name is Detective Sarah Darnell with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. I'm calling about a case from 1958 in Mon, Georgia. Does that name ring a bell?" A long pause. Then, "Mon, Lord, I haven't thought about that place in decades." "You lived there?" "Worked there, at Hall's Pharmacy. I was the pharmacist's assistant for, must have been 15 years. Sarah's heart beat faster. "Do you remember a woman named Mara Whitfield?" Another pause, longer this time. "Mara," Helen said slowly. "Yes, quiet woman, always very polite. She used to come in for nerve medication, I think. Sometimes other things." "What kind of other things?" "Well," Helen's voice grew uncertain. "This was a long time ago, you understand? But I do remember one order that struck me as odd. She came in asking for potassium cyanide. Said it was for cleaning silver. We sold it back then, pharmacies did, for photography chemicals and metalwork. It wasn't illegal or anything, but it wasn't common either." Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. "Do you remember when this was?" "Early spring 1958, I'd say. March, maybe?" I remember because it was right before. She trailed off. Right before what? Right before her husband went missing, Helen said quietly. The whole town talked about it. Police came around asking questions, but no one thought to mention the cyanide. Why would we? We didn't know it mattered. Sarah closed her eyes. Mrs. Dyer, did you ever sign any documents for Mara Whitfield? Witness any paperwork? Oh, I might have, Helen said. She asked me once to witness something. A form, I think. I didn't read it. She said it was for insurance. I signed my name, and that was that. H. Dyer. Mrs. Dyer, would you be willing to provide a formal statement about this? A long silence stretched across the phone line. Then softly, Is this about Harold? Yes, ma'am. Did she do it? Did Mara kill him? Sarah chose her words carefully. We're investigating that possibility. Helen Dyer let out a long, shaky breath. I always wondered, she said. All these years I wondered. Yes, detective, I'll tell you whatever you need to know. Sarah hung up the phone and sat in the empty conference room, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. The puzzle pieces were fitting together now, forming a picture that was both crystal clear and deeply horrifying. Mara Whitfield had purchased cyanide. She'd forged her husband's signature on a life insurance policy. She'd poisoned his coffee. And then, when he'd stepped out onto the porch for a cigarette, the poison had taken effect, quietly, efficiently, fatally. Harold Whitfield hadn't vanished. He'd been murdered in his own home, by the woman who'd served him dinner and kissed him goodnight, and she'd gotten away with it for 47 years. Sarah opened her case file and wrote in careful, deliberate handwriting. November 12, 2005. Chemical analysis confirms cyanide poisoning. Insurance policy forged. Witness confirms purchase of potassium cyanide by suspect. Probable cause established. Next step, locate suspect. She underlined the last two words. Somewhere out there, Mara Whitfield, or whatever name she was using now, was still alive. Still free, but not for much longer. The thermos had spoken, and now finally, justice was listening. Finding Mara Whitfield took less time than Sarah Darnell had expected. Modern databases had a way of making the invisible visible, of pulling people out of hiding even when they thought they'd successfully disappeared. The trail started with the insurance payout. Kevin Park traced the $40,000 check, cashed in August 1958, to a bank account in Asheville, North Carolina, opened under the name Mara Louise Ellison, her maiden name. From there, the path grew fainter, but never completely vanished. A marriage license in 1963 to a man named Robert Keller, who died of a heart attack in 1979. A property sale in 1982. A new address in Knoxville. Then another in Chattanooga. And finally, in 1998, a small house purchased in Provo, Utah, under the name Mara Ellison once again. She'd moved through the years like water through cracks, quietly, methodically, leaving just enough of a trail to be real, but not enough to be noticed. Sarah sat at her desk on a cold November afternoon, staring at the most recent address, 847 Maple Street, Provo, Utah. Satellite imagery showed a modest single-story home with a neat lawn, a white picket fence, and a bird bath in the front yard. The kind of house where a grandmother might live. The kind of place that looked safe. But Sarah knew better. She'd seen the lab reports. She'd read Helen Dyer's statement. She'd studied the forged signature, the insurance policy, the timeline that lined up too perfectly to be coincidence. Mara Ellison had killed her husband, buried him, collected the money, and walked away. And for 47 years, no one had stopped her. Sarah pulled up the Utah DMV records and found a driver's license photo from 2003. The woman staring back at the camera was 81 years old, white-haired and thin, with deep lines around her mouth and eyes. But the bone structure was unmistakable. The same narrow chin, the same high cheekbones, the same pale, steady gaze that had looked at Ed Lawson across a kitchen table in 1958 and lied without blinking. Sarah zoomed in on the photo, There, on the woman's left wrist, barely visible in the image, was a small crescent-shaped scar, the same scar visible in the wedding photo from 1948. It was her. Sarah contacted the Provo Police Department and requested a welfare check, framed as a routine inquiry. The responding officer reported back within hours. Mara Ellison was alive, living alone, in good health for her age. The neighbors described her as kind, quiet, and always baking pies for the block parties. One neighbor, a woman named Susan Vreeland, had been particularly effusive. "Oh, Mrs. Ellison is a sweetheart. She brings me lemon meringue pie every Easter, never misses a birthday. She's the kind of neighbor everyone wishes they had." Sarah read the report twice, feeling something cold and sharp settle in her stomach. The kind of neighbor everyone wishes they had. The same way Mara had probably been described in Macon, Georgia, before her husband vanished. Polite, composed, thoughtful, a woman who baked pies and poisoned coffee. Sarah began building the case for an arrest warrant. She compiled the forensic report, Helen Dyer's statement, the forged insurance policy, the financial record showing Mara's movements after Harold's death. She cross-referenced property records and found that Harold's last construction site, Lot 14, had never been transferred out of his name before Mara sold it in 1960, meaning she'd had legal access to the property for 2 years after his disappearance. 2 years to bury a body, 2 years to let concrete cure and grass grow over the truth. Lieutenant Webb reviewed the file and approved the warrant request. But the process would take days. Coordination between Georgia and Utah, formal paperwork, judicial review. Sarah knew she should wait. She knew protocol demanded patience, but she also knew that Mara Ellison was 81 years old, and time, which had protected her for nearly 50 years, might still be on her side. So on November 18, 2005, 3 days before the warrant was expected to be signed, Sarah did something she would later struggle to explain in official reports. She picked up her office phone, dialed the number listed for Mara Ellison in Provo, Utah, and waited. The phone rang 4 times. Then a woman's voice answered, thin and steady. "Hello?" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. "Hello. Is this Mrs. Mara Ellison?" "Yes, it is. Who's calling, please?" "My name is Sarah Darnell. I'm calling from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation." A pause. Not long, maybe 2 seconds, but long enough for Sarah to hear the shift, the subtle intake of breath. "Georgia," Mara said softly, almost wonderingly. "My, that's a name I haven't heard in decades." Sarah kept her voice neutral, professional. "I'm part of a team working on historical records preservation. We're digitizing old case files from the 1950s and 60s, and your name came up in connection with a missing person case from 1958. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions." Another pause. Longer this time. "I see," Mara said. "What kind of questions?" "Just clarifying details for our records," Sarah said, her pen poised over her notepad. "Do you remember living in Macon, Georgia in the late 1950s? "I do." "And you were married at that time to a man named Harold Whitfield?" Silence. Sarah waited, letting the silence stretch, feeling the weight of it on the line. "Yes," Mara said finally. "I was married to Harold." "Do you remember the night he disappeared?" "Of course I remember." Mara's voice remained calm, almost pleasant. "It was a terrible time, very confusing." Sarah glanced at the wedding photo on her desk. Harold and Mara standing in front of the church, not touching, their smiles stiff and cold. "Mrs. Ellison, in your recollection, what happened that night?" "He went outside to smoke," Mara said, the words coming smoothly, as if she'd rehearsed them 1,000 times. "I was upstairs. When I came back down, he was gone. The police searched everywhere, but they never found him." "That must have been very difficult for you." "It was," Mara said, though time has a way of softening even the hardest memories. Sarah's grip tightened on the pen. "Mrs. Ellison, do you remember a woman named Helen Dyer? She worked at Hall's Pharmacy in Mon. The pause was longer this time, much longer. Helen, Mara said slowly. Yes, I think I remember her. Sweet woman. She remembers you too, Sarah said quietly. She remembers selling you potassium cyanide in March of 1958. For polishing silver, you said. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the distant murmur of voices in the hallway outside her office. When Mara spoke again, her voice had changed, not louder, not harsher, but somehow clearer, stripped of pretense. Detective Darnell, she said. That is what you are, isn't it? Not a historian. Sarah's breath caught. Yes, ma'am, I'm a detective. I thought so. Mara's tone was almost conversational now, the way someone might discuss the weather or a recipe. You're wondering about Harold. I am. And you think you know what happened? I do. Another pause. Then so softly Sarah almost missed it. Some things are better left to the rain, dear. Sarah felt ice slide down her spine. What does that mean? It means, Mara said, her voice still calm, still steady, that the past should stay buried. It means that digging up old graves only brings pain. It means that sometimes, detective, the rain washes things away for a reason. The rain didn't wash away the cyanide in Harold's thermos, Sarah said. Silence. Mrs. Ellison? I think, Mara said quietly, that this conversation is over. Mrs. Ellison, I need to... The line went dead. Sarah sat holding the phone, her hand trembling slightly, staring at nothing. She'd heard confessions before, tearful, angry, defiant, but she'd never heard anything like that. The calm, the control, the absolute lack of remorse. Some things are better left to the rain. She set the phone down and immediately called Lieutenant Webb. We need to move now, she said, before she runs. The warrant isn't signed yet. She knows, Sarah interrupted. I just talked to her. She knows we're coming. Webb swore under his breath. I'll call Utah PD. We'll put surveillance on the house until the paperwork clears. Sarah hung up and sat in the empty office, the case file spread before her, the thermos sitting in its evidence bag on the corner of her desk. She thought about Ed Lawson, the deputy who'd written suspicion remains and carried it to his grave. She thought about Harold Whitfield, stepping onto his porch for a cigarette and never coming back. And she thought about Mara Ellison, 81 years old, baking pies for her neighbors, living quietly in Utah while the man she'd murdered lay buried beneath concrete and time. Not anymore. Sarah opened her laptop and began typing the final warrant application, her fingers moving fast and sure across the keyboard. The rain had tried to wash the truth away, but some stains, she knew, never really disappeared. They just waited for someone willing to look. The warrant came through on November 21, 2005, but Sarah Darnell was already in Georgia, standing in the Bibb County Property Records Office, tracing the history of a piece of land that had changed hands 4 times since 1958. Lot 14, Harold Whitfield's last project, the lakeside cabins that were supposed to transform Mon's economy but never got past the foundation stage. According to the construction permits filed in March 1958, Harold had poured a concrete pad on March 20th, 2 days before he disappeared. The project had been abandoned after his vanishing. The property left dormant for nearly 3 years before being sold to a developer in 1961. That developer had built a small campground, which had changed ownership twice more before landing in the hands of Pine Lake Recreation, a family-run business that now operated rental cabins, a boat launch, and a small general store. Sarah stood at the property records counter, studying a faded blueprint from 1958, her finger tracing the outline of the original foundation. The concrete pad measured 20 by 30 feet, large enough for the main cabin Harold had planned to build. On the current satellite imagery, that same spot now sat beneath Cabin 7, a modest A-frame structure that had been built in 1962. She called Lieutenant Webb. "We need to excavate," she said. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. The timeline fits." The location fits, and Mara had access to the property for 2 years after Harold disappeared, plenty of time to bury a body before the new construction started. Excavating someone's rental property is going to require more than a hunch, Darnell. It's not a hunch, Sarah said quietly. It's the only place that makes sense. Webb sighed. I'll call the DA, but we're bringing ground-penetrating radar first. If we don't find anything, we stop. Agreed? Agreed. 3 days later, on a cold, overcast morning in late November, Sarah stood in the gravel parking lot of Pine Lake Recreation, watching a GBI forensic team unload equipment from 2 white vans. The property owner, a man in his 60s named Dale Pritchard, stood beside her with his arms crossed, his expression somewhere between curious and deeply unhappy. "You really think there's a body under my cabin?" he asked. "We think it's possible," Sarah said. "We'll know more in a few hours." The ground-penetrating radar team, 2 technicians named Rodriguez and Chen, set up their equipment while a small crowd began to gather. News traveled fast in Macon, Georgia. By noon, a dozen locals had appeared, standing at a respectful distance behind the yellow police tape, murmuring among themselves. Some were old enough to remember Harold Whitfield. Others had only heard the stories. Sarah watched as Rodriguez and Chen dragged the GPR unit across the ground in a careful grid pattern, the machine emitting soft electronic beeps as it mapped the subsurface. The process was slow, methodical, the kind of work that required patience. Sarah had plenty of that. An hour passed, then another. The crowd grew larger. Someone brought folding chairs. A few people held umbrellas as a light drizzle began to fall. Not heavy, just enough to dampen the air and make the ground smell like wet earth and pine needles. Then, at 2:47 p.m., Rodriguez stopped and motioned to Chen. They both stared at the display screen, pointing, conferring in low voices. Rodriguez looked up and caught Sarah's eye. "Detective," he called, "you need to see this." Sarah crossed the distance quickly, her boots squelching in the damp grass. Rodriguez turned the screen toward her. The image showed layers of soil, dense and uniform, except for one area approximately 4 feet below the surface. There, rendered in shades of green and blue, was a void, an irregularity in the earth, roughly 6 feet long and 2 feet wide. "That's not natural," Chen said. "Something's been buried there." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "How deep?" 4 feet, maybe 4.5. Beneath the original concrete pad. Looks like it was dug before the foundation was poured. Sarah turned to Lieutenant Webb, who'd arrived an hour earlier and had been watching from the sidelines. "We need to dig." Webb nodded. "Do it." By 4 p.m., a forensic excavation team had arrived with shovels, screens, and floodlights. The crowd behind the police tape had swelled to nearly 50 people. Sarah recognized a few faces from the old case files, elderly now, but still there, still watching. One woman, probably in her 80s, stood with a cane, her eyes fixed on the dig site, her lips moving in what might have been prayer. The excavation began slowly, carefully. The top layer of soil was removed in controlled sections, each shovelful examined and sifted. As the hole deepened, the work slowed even more. Forensic archaeologist Dr. Nina Flores took over, using hand trowels and brushes to expose each layer with surgical precision. The sun dropped toward the horizon. The floodlights came on, casting harsh white beams across the excavation site. The drizzle continued, turning the exposed earth dark and slick. The crowd stood silent now, watching with the kind of reverence usually reserved for funerals. At 6:23 p.m., Dr. Flores stopped digging and called Sarah over. "I've got something." Sarah knelt at the edge of the pit. There, barely visible in the wet clay, was a glint of tarnished metal. Dr. Flores brushed the soil away with gentle strokes, revealing a belt buckle, brass, corroded, but still intact. "Keep going," Sarah said softly. Over the next 2 hours, the excavation continued under the floodlights, the rain falling harder now, drumming against the plastic tarp the team had erected over the site. Slowly, carefully, Dr. Flores uncovered what lay beneath the belt buckle, fabric remnants, rotted and compressed. Then bone, a femur, gray and weathered. Then more bones, wrapped in what appeared to be burlap that had mostly disintegrated. The skeleton was laid out on its back, arms at its sides. The skull was intact, the jaw slightly open, and on the left wrist, barely visible beneath decades of corrosion, was a watch, the metal band eaten away by rust, but the back plate still legible under Dr. Flores's flashlight. She brushed the surface clean and read aloud. H.W. Harold Whitfield. The crowd behind the tape had gone completely silent. Sarah stood at the edge of the excavation, rain soaking through her jacket, watching as Dr. Flores and her team carefully exposed the rest of the remains. She thought about Ed Lawson, who'd stood in this same spot 47 years earlier, searching for answers he'd never find. She thought about his logbook, the words he'd written in private. If truth sinks, the rain will bring it back someday. He'd been right. Dr. Flores collected bone samples and sealed them in evidence containers. Later analysis would confirm what Sarah already knew. Trace amounts of cyanide were present in the bone tissue, concentrated in the ribs and spine, consistent with ingestion of a lethal dose. By 9:00 p.m., the remains had been fully excavated, photographed, and transported to the GBI forensic lab in Atlanta. The excavation site was covered with tarps and secured with additional police tape. The crowd slowly dispersed, people walking back to their cars in silence, their faces pale in the floodlights. Sarah stood alone at the edge of the pit, rain streaming down her face, staring at the rectangular void in the earth where Harold Whitfield had lain for 47 years, buried beneath the foundation of the dream he'd been building, beneath concrete and soil and time, waiting for someone to find him. An older man approached from the crowd, thin, white-haired, with deep lines around his eyes. He stopped a few feet from Sarah and spoke quietly. "My father was Ed Lawson," he said, "the deputy who worked this case." Sarah turned to face him. "I know. His notes are the reason we found Harold." The man nodded slowly, his eyes wet with something that might be tear or rain. He never let it go, not for the rest of his life. He always said something was wrong. He always said she did it. "He was right," Sarah said. "I know." The man looked past her, toward the excavation site. "I just wish he'd lived to see it." "He did see it," Sarah said quietly. "He saw it 50 years ago. He just didn't have the tools to prove it." The man stood there for a moment longer, then nodded once and walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the floodlights. Sarah pulled out her phone and called Webb. "We've got him," she said. "Harold Whitfield. Positive ID. Cyanide traces confirmed. He was buried exactly where I thought he'd be." "Good work, Darnell," Webb said. "Now let's go get her." Sarah hung up and stood in the rain, watching the forensic team pack up their equipment, the floodlights casting long shadows across the muddy ground. Somewhere in the distance she heard the sound of a car engine starting, headlights cutting through the mist as one of the locals drove away. She whispered into the rain, her voice barely audible above the sound of water dripping from the tarp. He was never missing, he was right here. All along, right beneath their feet, waiting for the truth to surface. And now, finally, it had. By morning, the news had spread through Mon like wildfire. The local paper ran the headline, "Body found at Lake Benmore. Whitfield case solved after 47 years." The story made regional news, then state news, then national. Reporters descended on the small town, interviewing anyone old enough to remember Harold and Mara, asking the same question over and over. How did she get away with it for so long? And in living rooms and diners across Mon, people whispered the same answer. Lawson knew. He always knew. Sarah drove back to Atlanta that afternoon, exhausted but unable to sleep. There was still work to do. Harold Whitfield had been found. Now it was time to bring his killer home. They came for her at dawn. Sarah Darnell stood on the quiet street in Provo, Utah, watching the sky lighten from black to deep purple to pale gray, her breath forming small clouds in the cold December air. Behind her, 3 vehicles sat with their engines idling, 2 Provo Police Department cruisers and an unmarked GBI sedan. Lieutenant Webb stood beside her, his face grave. 4 Utah detectives waited near the patrol cars, their expressions professional and detached. This was routine for them. For Sarah, it felt like the end of something that had started 47 years ago in the rain. At 6:15 a.m., they approached the house at 847 Maple Street. The white picket fence gleamed faintly in the pre-dawn light. The birdbath sat empty, a thin layer of frost coating its basin. Lights were on inside, the kitchen window glowing warm and yellow. Sarah knocked. 3 firm raps that echoed in the quiet morning. The door opened almost immediately, as if Mara Ellison had been waiting. She stood in the doorway wearing a pale blue cardigan over a floral dress, her white hair pinned neatly, her face composed and calm. She looked exactly like her driver's license photo, thin, elderly, unremarkable, the kind of grandmother you'd see at a church bake sale, except for her eyes. Those pale, steady eyes that had looked at Ed Lawson across a kitchen table in 1958 and lied without flinching. "Mrs. Ellison," Sarah said, holding up her badge, "I'm Detective Sarah Darnell with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant for your arrest." Mara didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her hands folded at her waist, her gaze fixed on Sarah's face. Then quietly, almost gently, she asked, "Did you find him?" Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. "Yes, ma'am. We found Harold." Mara closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again. "Where?" "Lot 14, beneath the foundation of the cabin he was building." A small nod, as if this confirmed something she'd always known. "I see. Mrs. Ellison, I need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back." Mara didn't resist. She turned slowly, extending her thin wrists, the crescent scar on her left wrist visible in the porch light. Sarah cuffed her gently, reading her rights in a steady voice while the Utah detectives secured the house. As they walked her to the patrol car, one of Mara's neighbors, Susan Vreeland, the woman who'd praised her lemon meringue pies, stood on her front lawn in a bathrobe, her hand over her mouth, watching in shock. Mara glanced at her once, briefly, then looked away. They drove her to the Provo Police Department for processing, then transported her to the county jail to await extradition to Georgia. Through it all, Mara remained calm, cooperative, almost serene. She answered questions with yes ma'am and no ma'am, signed the paperwork where indicated, and never once asked for a lawyer. That should have been Sarah's first warning. 2 days later, after extradition had been approved and Mara had been transported back to Georgia, Sarah sat across from her in a gray interrogation room in the Bibb County Sheriff's Office, the same building where Ed Lawson had once worked, though it had been renovated twice since then. The room was small, windowless, lit by harsh fluorescent lights. A camera mounted in the corner recorded everything. Mara sat with her hands folded on the metal table, her expression peaceful, almost meditative. She'd waived her right to an attorney. She'd agreed to speak on the record, and when Sarah pressed the record button and stated the date, time, and names of those present, Mara simply nodded and said, "I'm ready." "Mrs. Ellison," Sarah began, her voice steady, "you've been charged with the murder of Harold James Whitfield in March of 1958. Do you understand the charges?" "I do." "Do you wish to make a statement?" Mara looked at her hands for a long moment, then raised her eyes to meet Sarah's. "I never meant to kill him," she said softly. "I just wanted him to sleep." Sarah kept her face neutral, though her pulse quickened. "Can you explain what you mean by that?" Mara's voice remained calm, almost dreamy, as if she were recounting a story from someone else's life. "Harold was a good man," she said. "Everyone always said so. Strong, hard-working, reliable. But he didn't listen. He never listened. He made all the decisions, where we'd live, how we'd spend money, what we'd do with our lives. I was just there, a decoration, someone to cook his meals and iron his shirts. She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. I tried to talk to him. I tried to tell him I was lonely, that I wanted more than just being his wife. But he'd smile and pat my hand and say, "Don't worry about it, Mara. I'll take care of everything." As if I were a child. Sarah leaned forward slightly. "So you decided to poison him?" "No," Mara said, shaking her head. "Not at first. I just wanted him to stop, to be quiet for a while, to give me space to think." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I thought if I put just a little in his coffee, he'd get drowsy. He'd sleep. And maybe while he slept, I could figure out what to do, how to leave, how to make him understand. But that's not what happened." Mara closed her eyes. "No, that's not what happened." Sarah pulled out a photograph, the thermos sealed in its evidence bag, and placed it on the table. "Tell me about this." Mara stared at the image, her face unreadable. "I bought the cyanide from Hall's pharmacy," she said quietly. "Helen sold it to me. She was such a sweet woman. She never asked questions." "What did you do with it?" "I put it in his coffee that night, March 22nd. He'd been working late on those cabin plans and he was tired. I made him dinner, catfish and creamed corn, his favorite. And I poured the coffee from that thermos. I stirred it. My hands were shaking so badly I thought he'd notice. But he didn't. He just smiled and said it was good." Sarah's voice remained steady. "Then what happened?" "He went outside to smoke. He said, 'I'll be right back.' He always said that." Mara's eyes grew distant, as if she were looking through time. "I watched him from the window. He lit his cigarette. He leaned against the railing. And then he just stopped. He didn't fall. He didn't cry out. He just stopped moving, like someone had turned off a switch." The room was silent except for the faint hum of the recording equipment. "What did you do then?" Sarah asked. "I waited," Mara said. "I waited until I was sure he wasn't breathing. Then I went outside. It was raining. I remember the rain. It was so loud. I dragged him to the car. It took me 3 tries to get him into the trunk. I drove to Lot 14. I'd been there before, helping Harold with measurements. I knew where he'd poured the foundation. I knew there was loose dirt beside it." "You buried him there?" "Yes, I dug through the night. It took hours. My hands were bleeding by the time I finished. I wrapped him in burlap and covered him with soil. Then I went home, cleaned the car, and waited for morning." She looked directly at Sarah. "And when morning came, I called the police and said he was missing." Sarah studied her face, searching for remorse, for emotion, for something human beneath the calm surface. "Do you regret it?" Mara was quiet for a long time. Then, "I regret that I had to, but I don't regret being free." The trial began in April 2006, nearly 48 years after Harold Whitfield's death. The courtroom in the Bibb County Courthouse was packed. Reporters, locals, legal observers, and members of Harold's extended family who'd traveled from across the state to finally see justice served. Sarah sat in the front row, watching as the prosecution laid out the case piece by piece. The forensic report showing cyanide in Harold's bones, Helen Dyer's testimony about selling potassium cyanide to Mara, the forged insurance policy, the financial records showing Mara had cashed the $40,000 and disappeared, and at the center of it all, displayed in a glass case on the prosecution's table, was the thermos. Exhibit number 1. The press had started calling it the coffee that spoke, and the name had stuck. Mara sat at the defense table, quiet and composed, wearing the same navy dress she'd worn to Ed Lawson's interviews in 1958. Her court-appointed attorney had advised her not to testify, but she'd insisted. She took the stand on the 4th day of trial and repeated her confession calmly, methodically, without tears. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman, a middle-aged man with graying hair, stood and read the verdict in a clear, steady voice. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Someone in the back row, one of Harold's nieces, let out a sob. Sarah sat perfectly still, feeling no triumph, no satisfaction. Only a deep, quiet exhaustion. Mara didn't react. She simply nodded once, as if she'd expected this, and folded her hands in her lap. At sentencing 2 weeks later, the judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Patricia Holcomb, looked down at Mara and spoke in a voice that carried through the silent courtroom. "Mrs. Ellison, you took a man's life with careful premeditation. You buried him, collected insurance money, and lived freely for nearly half a century while his family wondered what had happened to him. The law may have been slow to find you, but it has found you, and now you will answer for what you did." She sentenced Mara Whitfield to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Mara stood to be led away, and for just a moment she turned and looked at Sarah. Their eyes met across the courtroom. Mara's expression was unreadable, neither defiant nor apologetic. Just empty. Then she was gone, escorted through the side door by 2 bailiffs, disappearing into the hallway that would lead her to a cell where she would spend the rest of her days. Sarah walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon sun, feeling the weight of 47 years finally lifting. She thought about Ed Lawson, who died never knowing he'd been right. She thought about Harold Whitfield, who'd stepped onto his porch for a cigarette and never came back. And she thought about justice, how it wasn't always loud or triumphant. Sometimes it was just quiet, patient, waiting, like rain that falls and washes things clean. On May 3, 2006, the state of Georgia formally closed case number 580422, Whitfield Harold James. The final entry in the GBI database read simply, "Murder first degree, solved, perpetrator convicted and sentenced, status, closed." 48 years after a man vanished from his porch on a rainy March night, the file that had gathered dust in a cardboard box, survived floods and renovations and nearly being thrown away, was finally, officially, resolved. Sarah Darnell printed the closure report and filed it in the archives, but she kept a copy on her desk, not as a trophy but as a reminder that the dead don't stop speaking just because no one's listening, that truth doesn't have an expiration date, that sometimes justice moves slowly but it moves. Ed Lawson's son called her a week after the sentencing. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My father spent his whole life wondering. Now I can tell my grandchildren he was right." "He was always right," Sarah said. "We just finally caught up to him." Mara Ellison, she never went back to using the name Whitfield, was transferred to Metro State Prison, a women's facility outside Atlanta. At 82, she was one of the oldest inmates in the Georgia correctional system. The warden's report noted that she was a model prisoner, quiet, polite, caused no trouble. She worked in the prison library, shelving books and helping other inmates write letters. She received no visitors, no letters, no phone calls. On the intake form, under next of kin, she'd written, "None." Sarah visited her once, 6 months into her sentence. She wasn't sure why. Maybe to see if Mara had changed, if prison had broken through that eerie calm, or maybe just to look her in the eye one more time and understand how someone could live with what she'd done for nearly 50 years. They sat across from each other in the visitation room, separated by scratched plexiglass, speaking through phones mounted on the wall. Mara looked smaller, frailer, her white hair thinner, her hands trembling slightly. But her eyes were the same, pale, steady, unreadable. "Why did you come?" Mara asked. Sarah wasn't sure how to answer. "I wanted to ask you something." "Ask." "Do you ever think about him? Harold?" Mara was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. Then softly, "Every day." "Does it bother you, what you did?" Mara looked up, meeting Sarah's gaze. "Would it matter if I said yes?" Sarah considered this. "I don't know. Maybe." "Then yes," Mara said. It bothers me. Not because I feel guilty, I stopped feeling that a long time ago, but because I wonder what would have happened if I'd just left, if I'd taken my things and walked out the door instead of... She trailed off, then shook her head. But I didn't. And that's that. That's that, Sarah echoed. They sat in silence for a moment. The sounds of the visitation room, murmured conversations, crying children, buzzing fluorescent lights, filling the space between them. Do you hate me? Mara asked. Sarah thought about it. No, I don't hate you. I just think you're sad. Mara smiled faintly, the first real emotion Sarah had ever seen from her. Yes, she said quietly. I suppose I am. That was the last time they spoke. On January 14, 2008, Mara Ellison died in her sleep at Metro State Prison. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, natural, unremarkable, the kind of quiet exit most people hope for. She was 84 years old. Her body was held at the prison morgue for 30 days, per state protocol, waiting for someone to claim it. No one did. Eventually, she was cremated at state expense, her ashes interred in an unmarked section of the prison cemetery, where unclaimed inmates are laid to rest. Sarah learned about it 3 weeks later, when a clerk from the Department of Corrections sent a routine notification to close out the case file. She stared at the email for a long time, feeling something she couldn't quite name. Not satisfaction, not sadness, just finality. Harold Whitfield had waited 47 years for justice. Mara had lived with her secret just as long, and now they were both gone, their story reduced to court records and news clippings, and a thermos in an evidence locker. But the story didn't end there. In the fall of 2008, the Bibb County Historical Society approached the county commissioners with a proposal. They wanted to create a permanent exhibit in the courthouse, a display commemorating the Whitfield case and honoring the work of both Ed Lawson and Sarah Darnell. The commissioners, recognizing the educational value and the national attention the case had received, approved the project. On October 15, 2008, 50 years and 7 months after Harold Whitfield vanished, the exhibit opened to the public on the second floor of the Bibb County Courthouse, in a glass display case mounted on the wall outside the records office. At the center of the display sat the thermos, polished, sealed, and mounted on a small wooden stand. The silver was still dented, the initials HW still visible on the base. Beside it, under protective glass, was Ed Lawson's handwritten note from 1958, the one that had been tucked into the case file. Everything looks too clean. Suspicion remains. And below that, mounted on a brass plaque, was a quote from Sarah Darnell's closing statement at trial: "Justice doesn't age, it waits." The exhibit included photographs: Harold and Mara's wedding picture, the house on Lake Benmore, the excavation site at Lot 14, the moment Sarah had held up the corroded watch with Harold's initials. There was a timeline of the investigation, copies of key documents, and a brief biography of Ed Lawson, whose instincts had been vindicated half a century too late for him to know it. The local paper ran a feature on the exhibit's opening. Sarah attended, standing quietly in the back of the small crowd, while the county commissioner gave a speech about persistence and truth. She didn't want to speak, didn't want to be the center of attention. This wasn't her story. It was Harold's, and Ed Lawson's, and even, in a strange way, Mara's. After the ceremony, an elderly woman approached her. She was thin, bent with age, leaning heavily on a cane. Sarah recognized her from the excavation, the woman who'd stood watching with her lips moving in prayer. "You're Detective Darnell," the woman said. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm Dorothy Whitfield, Harold's cousin." Sarah straightened. "I'm so glad to meet you." Dorothy looked at the display, her eyes lingering on Harold's photograph. "I was 14 when he disappeared. I remember thinking he'd come back, that it was all a mistake. We waited for years. My aunt, his mother, died still waiting." "I'm sorry," Sarah said. "Don't be." Dorothy turned to her, her eyes wet but clear. "You found him. You brought him home. That's all any of us wanted." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. Dorothy reached out and squeezed her hand. "Thank you," she whispered. Then she turned and walked slowly toward the exit, her cane tapping softly against the courthouse floor. The exhibit became a fixture in Bibb County, visited by school groups, tourists, and true crime enthusiasts from across the country. The thermos, the coffee that spoke, as the press still called it, became a symbol of how science and persistence could crack even the coldest cases. And in Macon, Georgia, the story became legend. On stormy nights when rain swept across Lake Benmore and thunder rolled through the pines, locals still told the tale. They spoke of Harold Whitfield, the builder who'd stepped onto his porch for a cigarette and never returned. They told of Mara, the woman who'd fooled an entire town with her calm smiles and poisoned coffee. They remembered Ed Lawson, the deputy who'd known the truth but couldn't prove it, and Sarah Darnell, the detective who'd finally listened to the dead. Teenagers still dared each other to walk past the old Whitfield house after dark. Though it had been renovated so many times, the original structure was barely recognized. Some claimed they saw a porch light flickering in the rain, even though the house had been rewired decades ago. Others swore they heard footsteps on rainy nights, pacing the yard, searching for something lost. Sarah returned to Macon only once more, on a gray afternoon in March 2010. 52 years, almost to the day, after Harold's death. She drove out to Lake Benmore, parked near what had once been Lot 14, and walked through the campground where families now roasted marshmallows and fished from the dock. She stood at the spot where they'd excavated Harold's body, now covered with grass and marked by nothing except her memory. The lake was calm, reflecting the overcast sky like glass. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Children laughed. Life had moved on, as it always did. She thought about the thermos in the courthouse, the brass plaque, the words she'd spoken without really thinking. Justice doesn't age. It waits. It had waited for Harold. It had waited for Ed Lawson. And in the end, it had come. Not with thunder or fanfare, but quietly, patiently, the way rain falls and washes things clean. That evening, Sarah drove back through Macon as the sun set behind the pines, casting long shadows across the small downtown. She passed the courthouse, its windows glowing in the fading light, and saw the reflection of the porch light exhibit in the glass, a small beacon, still shining after all these years. She thought about silence and memory and the stories towns carry in their bones. About how some truths refuse to stay buried no matter how deep you dig the hole. And she thought about Harold Whitfield, who'd said, "I'll be right back," and meant it, never knowing those would be his last words. In Macon, Georgia, the rain still falls on stormy nights. The lake still reflects the sky, and in the courthouse on the hill, a thermos sits behind glass, a testament to the fact that some voices speak loudest in silence. Because in Macon, Georgia, even silence has a memory, and some memories once awakened never sleep again. The message for us is clear. Truth requires both time and determined people willing to pursue it. Serve on juries when called, support those seeking justice, and never mistake silence for acceptance. Thank you for following the story of Harold Whitfield and the thermos that spoke after 47 years of silence. A case that proves justice may arrive late, but it never truly disappears. Subscribe to the channel to stay with us as we uncover more cold cases where the buried past refuses to stay quiet, and where patience and persistence finally bring the truth to light.